I'm Kayla Dice, and this is Your Life Path. I'm an out-of-control tabletop role-playing game designer, and on this show I talk to TTRPG designers and other exciting guests about everything that inspires or influences them away from role-playing. My guest today is an award-winning and critically acclaimed journalist and a co-founder of a new exciting independent TTRPG outlet, Rascal News, Lin Codega. Lin, thank you for coming on the show. Welcome to the show, and would you like to introduce yourself more fully to the audience?
Hello, happy to be here. Honestly, you covered the big stuff. I don't know what else is to say. I'm just a weirdo who really likes games and writes about them and is trying to make a living doing it. That's it. I don't know, man. I'm a journalist. I love writing. I have a dog. Go on long hikes in the woods where I don't see anyone for hours, and I love it. I think that's, long and short of it. I think you nailed it.
Awesome.
What else is
So
there to
it was in
say?
late February. What was that? Sorry.
What else is there to say? I'm just a weirdo.
What else? Yeah. Well, well, we'll dig into the exact kind of weirdo you are in this episode, I suppose. But it was in late February. You launched Rascal with Rowan Zioli and Chase Carter. It's reader-supported, worker-owned. It's home for TTRPG journalism. I imagine a lot of this episode is, in a sense, going to be like, what brought you to this point? But just at the top of the episode, could you share why you're excited to be a Rascal?
Yeah, so basically in late 2023, in November, I was laid off from my staff writer position at IO9. And it was one of those things where anyone who was in journalism, anyone who was in the industry, in media, even in marketing, could see the state of journalism as an industry was really suffering. And I was pretty sure that I was never going to be able to find another staff writing position where I would be able to kind of write about all the nerdy things that I really liked and cared about, and also specifically find a position that would allow me to write about tabletop role-playing games, because there just aren't really any large legacy outlets that care about tabletop role-playing games. So right around the time that I was laid off, I was like, okay, time to like do something about it. So I contacted Rowan, and then I contacted Chase, and we sort of all collaborated over the next 2-ish months, and we launched Rascal News for ourselves and for the community, and as sort of a rage against the journalism machine as we just try to make it. So that's kind of more or less what happened. Is just like I was laid off. I had no job. I had severance, and I was like, well, what am I supposed to do? Where am I supposed to go? And of course, as many people saw during early 2024, we saw huge layoffs across media, just generally speaking. It was really horrible to sort of be on the sidelines for that. Like, the Messenger shut down entirely. LA Times shut down, or like a lot of their work. Pitchfork got sold. Sports Illustrated went under. It's just like there's culture reporting really took a huge hit in early 2024. So, and that was while we were getting ready to launch. So it really solidified our purpose in a very clear way. We were like, we cannot subject ourselves to this industry that will just like destroy us over and over and over again. So we're trying something different.
You're not going to let yourself be chewed up by the machine that doesn't care about you individually. You're going to create a new way of making it, which is really exciting.
Yeah, we are very excited by it. We are, again, nowhere near sustainable as like a full-time thing for the three of us, but it's definitely, Chase has his other job, and I have savings, and Rowan lives for nothing in New York in like the smallest apartment imaginable. So she doesn't have a ton of expenses. So we are in positions where we're privileged enough to be able to take this risk and build this startup the way that like we want to see the industry change.
I'm rooting for you, and I hope lots of other people are as well, because it's something that I think if you care about a healthy creative scene, you want that to be to have a sort of healthy journalistic scene as well. And also, you should care about journalism for its own rights. But like, I definitely think if you're someone who's into TTRPGs, a world where just no one is talking about that with any interest or care is boring.
Yeah, and I think it's really hard because tabletop role playing games and board games also have really coverage for those spaces has really gone the way of the individual fan and the influencer and like the vlogger with a YouTube channel. Um, and there's like literally nothing wrong with having individual people talk about a piece of art, and I think that's really important part of the scene. But to have um, journalism and critique and have folks who are willing to do the sort of investigative work and go through the rigors of journalism as a craft rather than just like the way that citizen journalists often do it as a hobby, I think is different. They're both necessary, but they're different. And I think that journalism as a craft is something that is hard to learn and disappearing quickly. It's a trade, you know, like there's journalism school. Not that I ever went to journalism school, but it's there, right? Um, and there's so much to learn from going to school. You don't just learn how to like write whatever, you learn how to not get sued and to like how to investigate things and how to talk about something with authority and how to cite people and how to like remove um your opinion and replace it with a position. Like there's so much about journalism as like a trade craft that is very very specific and hard to replicate without actually being involved in journalism as a career, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, totally. It
Because
made
I
me.
think
It
that like
reminded me of someone who, as someone who used to be a wrestler. It made me think about the sort of like journalism scene that's in relation to wrestling, where ultimately, yeah, most outlets are in the form of like civilian journalists. They're not necessarily people who are practiced in the trade, and the sort of origins of most outlets, yeah, come more out of either newsletters and often stuff which was about like breaking kayfabe rather than doing journalism. And then like
mhm.
in that scene, I can think of like an instance that like when there were very sort of serious issues that well done trade journalism could have helped with. Most wrestling journalists were just so completely unequipped to deal with that, and many, in fact, made those situations worse.
Yeah, I think trade journalism and citizen journalism can absolutely exist side by side, and I don't think that one is better than the other. But I think that, especially in our contemporary cultural and artistic mode of operation, we need both for a healthy environment, like healthy critical environment. So yeah,
Yeah,
that's one of the reasons why I'm really excited about Rascal.
absolutely. So
Yeah.
though now, so starting from the present, I guess we jump back further into the past. Where did you grow up?
Where did I grow up? I grew up in Virginia mostly, Southern Virginia, really close to the North Carolina border, kind of the Tidewater area. Yeah, spent a lot of some like that's kind of the formative years. My mother was in the military, so we moved around a lot. And then by the time I hit high school, my mom was like, "We should probably make sure that our children like don't like can stay in one school for the duration of their like high school." So we did, which was great. So
And that was
yeah, just in
Virginia.
rural Virginia. Yes, just in rural Virginia with, you know, I went to a high school that was across from a peanut farm on one side and then a quarry in back and then a like tractor shop like a stone's throw away. So pretty pretty rural.
Yeah, those almost feel like on the nose touchstones of reality. With
Yeah,
peanut farm and
it was
tractor
very
shop
much like,
especially.
yeah, it was just there, you know, kind of in the middle of nowhere. Yeah, grew up in rural Virginia.
Did you have a sense of what you wanted to be when you were growing up?
Yes, I mean, I always knew I wanted to be a writer. I've been writing since I was a kid, whether that was fan fiction or short stories or poetry or you know whatever. I was always a writer, and when I was in high school, I was like in all the like weird advanced AP. No, did we have AP programs? I think we were so small we didn't even have AP programs. But like I was in like honors classes for like English and writing and stuff like that. And I went to school for writing, and I went to like yeah. So anyway, it was just one of those things. I always knew I wanted to be a writer. Journalist just sort of was a result of that accidentally.
Mm, that makes sense. I'll actually jump to some questions that I did have scheduled later because it's interesting. One thing I've been asking people on this season of the podcast is, do you remember when you first considered yourself a
Mm-hmm.
writer? And I feel from what you're saying, possibly no, because possibly that's just like a formative thing of you always thought of yourself that way.
Yeah, I don't know what I thought of myself as a writer. Yeah, I don't know. I've always sort of thought of myself as a writer. Yeah, it's I think that like writing and reading are so like intrinsically combined. Like when I was learning how to read and like figuring that out, and I was a voracious reader, I was like always like writing in my head. Just because it's not written down doesn't mean it's not writing. If it's something that you like consistently work towards and then like eventually perform the action of. So yeah, writing, rewriting, ideating, forming these sorts of thoughts that would like later eventually become whatever, something, written words. I don't know. I don't talk good, I write good. But yeah, just
Right,
I've
yeah.
always sort
No,
of
that
thought of
makes
myself as
sense
a
to
writer.
me. No, yeah. I think it's a really fascinating difference in how so many just an array of answers I've gotten. And it's interesting, yeah, because I think I remember, I don't necessarily know when I would have ever first considered myself a writer, but I definitely know like all of my school reports would in some way refer to me as a creative person, which I think from some
Hmm.
teachers was probably a backhanded compliment, but from others was maybe just meant sincerely.
Yep.
And I think I always had that sense. But I think I spent a lot of time going like, I just got to figure out what to create. And then a related question to
Yeah.
this: do you know when you first considered yourself a journalist as like as a thing you would say of yourself? I'm Lin Codega, a journalist.
Yeah, so I think the first time that I considered myself a journalist was when I got like my first full-time journalism job in I think late 2018, maybe early 2019, because it's like up until then I'd been doing like freelance writing, and um I've been working on a blog for like the company I worked for as like a marketing person. So it wasn't until I like was doing journalism as part of like my 9 to 5 where I was like, "Oh yeah, journalist."
Yeah,
But I'd been doing
that makes total
I'd been
sense.
doing journalism. Yeah. But I'd been doing like journalistic work before then for quite a long time. Like I did it in college as like part of the magazine. I did a couple columns or written reports or something. So it was one of those things where it was like I just didn't feel as if I was really working in the industry until I was like full, like doing it literally every single day.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. It is interesting to think about that disconnect, like not disconnect, but that period in your time where you wouldn't say I'm a journalist, but you would say I'm doing journalism or I'm doing journalistic work. But
Hmm.
seeing, I guess, like the noun form almost as more sort of purposeful in some way. So you just
Hmm.
mentioned college there. What did you go on to study after you finished high school?
Writing. I studied English. I got an English major, and I got like a film studies minor. I wasn't a very good
Oh,
student. Uh, yeah, I wasn't a very good student. Didn't really like college very much, and sort of fucked off into the woods quite often. Which always surprises my friends when I'm just like, yeah, I was like a C D student in college, and people were like, but like you can write so good and you're smart, and I'm like, I didn't give a shit about college. I'm just like, it's one of those things like maybe it was a college, maybe it was me, but yeah, studied English and got a minor in film studies.
yeah. Were you someone where I get like growing up, you had this idea of like, oh yeah, eventually I'll go to college and this will probably be the thing I study. Yeah, and I wonder if that maybe contributed to thing of
Mm.
just being like, well, I'm almost on a because I also kind of I enjoyed my time at university a lot, but I also think about it as like, oh, I'm so glad that it's a 3 year course because I was so like about to just fully topple off the rails by that end of that third year. I feel like an almost old school cartoon
Yeah.
where the vehicle like burns apart but across the finish line.
Yeah, I mean, I did know that I was going to go to school for English, and I sort of had the school that I went to in mind from around like eighth grade. I was like, yeah, I want to go to UVA and I want to study English. And then it was just one of those things where I was like, do I really want to go to college? And then I just like I went anyway. And sort of the whole time I was like, I could just be sailing, like I could just be sailing around the world right now. What am I doing here? Um, so basically as soon as I left college, I got a job in like this sort of like half boat sales yard up in like Massachusetts. And I was like, I'm just gonna be around boats all day. And then I realized being around boats all day meant being around like rich assholes all the time. And I'm like, shit, I made a mistake.
Yeah. What did you do after the
Yeah.
boatyard?
I got a job as sort of a editor, marketer, proofreader slash personal assistant to a an older gentleman who ran a poetry publishing press. So that was fun. Did that for about a year, and then he fired me because I refused
Damn.
to. What did I refuse to do? It was something very morally upright of me. And I felt good about it. Oh, he wanted me to transcribe poetry from one book into the manuscript for a book that he was editing. And I was like, do you have the rights to this? And he would not answer. And so I wouldn't transcribe it. And then he fired me.
Damn. Feels like strangely
Yeah.
weird when you're like, oh, I lost this job, but for like reasons that reflect so well on me.
Yeah. I mean, it wasn't even that. It was just one of those things I was like, I guess. Like, this is just the weirdest thing to let me go over because I'm like telling you I'm not going to do this if you don't. And poetry rights are so weird and so esoteric that you can literally just like call up a press and be like, hey, I'd like to republish it, and they would be like, great, here's an agreement, give us $50. So it
Yeah,
wasn't
it's
even
not
something that was
like
like that.
trying to get like a film reproduction right where, or like that's so like labyrinthian to sort of track down who holds
Yeah.
whatever. Yeah, I remember my last job I lost because I wouldn't sign a contract with where they wanted to cut like the amount they wanted me to be on an on again off again contract where I wouldn't like be paid for 2 months, and I was like not going to do that. And so then we are like, well, goodbye. But I'm like, every time I tell
Well,
people that, they're like, oh, good for you, and I'm like, yeah, I guess it makes the blow soften a little.
yeah. Yeah, so I did that. I don't know, I bounced around a little bit, did some like freelance graphic design, did some marketing work, did like work for a local magazine, and eventually got a job at like a marketing position for a nonprofit, and then journal. So always like around writing, being creative. Like my graphic design specialty was like book layout. It's not very exciting. I'm
Makes sense.
sorry.
No, it's interesting, and it's interesting because there are so many jobs where you are doing like acts of writing that I think aren't necessarily always seen as that way. Like I also think for the 4 years I was a teacher, obviously I was like writing teaching resources constantly at the same time as I would then write like book materials where I'm trying to convey
Mhm.
information in some sense. But actually, before I jump more specifically into your first journalism job, I wanted to ask, what was your introduction to TTRPGs?
So formally, probably in college with D&D 3.5. Just had like a bad experience with a pretty solidly male play group, and I was like, this is not it. Which is sort of like the typical, I think, everyone femme presenting or like who is viewed as a femme person has that kind of experience. It feels universal and that horrible.
Yeah.
And but really, like, since I was like a kid, like 10 or 11 or 12, I was doing like forum based play by post role plays. And
Ah.
that's really where like the tabletop role playing game kind of got started. And then of course after college found real people who were like really playing D&D, and that was fun. Listened to Taz a lot. That was also fun. And Friends of the Table, also fun. I just kept getting more and more into smaller and smaller games. Yeah.
Just
So
shrinking
that's it. But
gradually.
Yeah. I mean, but really, like, started, in the early 2000s with forums and play by post role playing.
It's funny because I always say when I am asked this question, I got into role playing games in 2018, or some other year. I actually can't remember. No, 17 probably, when I went to an indie games meet with partner. But also, I'm like, no, I played a lot of like, in retrospect, weirdly gender obsessed Power Rangers message board role play games. And I think in some cases maybe that's the
Yes.
hidden route for my game design practice.
We love it. I think it's one of those sort of hidden subcultures that is sort of really just starting to come to light as like the folks who, you know, operated in those forums like get more into game design or like start talking about how that like impacted their game design. But yeah, forum based role playing games were so huge in the 2000s, in like the early mid 2000s. And I think it's one of those, again, kind of this weird niche subculture that is really starting to come to bear in a lot of like popular game design.
Yeah, I can imagine that definitely is people who were like teens or preteens playing those like come of age essentially and maybe approach different creative pursuits. But yeah, I just wanted to establish that as a base first because I wanted to ask like what first brought you to I guess like the wider field of like pop culture journalism.
Well, two incidents happened when I was 10. One was I went to go see Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, uh, because apparently my father's decided that was an appropriate movie to go to bring your 10-year-old child to. Um, and I loved it so much that we went a second time. And then the very next year, Lord of the Rings came out. And I'd always been like a huge fantasy reader. I think Tamora Pierce was like my big fantasy obsession when I was a kid. Um, and it was sort of like all of those things combined and like a persistent love of Star Wars, just sort of like the whole pop culture melange of nerdery. Because my father was a nerd, my mother is a nerd ish. She's a nerd light, nerd light, but my father is like huge. So it was just one of those things where yeah, just sort of was always into science fiction fantasy, was always encouraged to read, was taken to see Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon at a very formative age. And that was that, couldn't be
That's like a
helped.
big building block where you can be like, yeah, no, that's the butterfly effect from there, that crouching tiger, hidden dragon.
It was incredible. It was unlike anything I'd ever seen. And I know that it's not a very popular movie in China and the Eastern film canon. But it was, one of the first films that Western audiences had access to that was in the wuxia genre, and I don't know, it just blew my little 10-year-old mind.
No, it
Yeah.
makes sense. Like I only saw Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon probably when I was. I actually probably. I think I probably must have seen it first when I was maybe like 16 or 17, when I started studying film studies in college, which in college UK just means like the last year's equivalent of high school. And I was like, if I'm studying film, I should get more into film. So I just like binged all of the stuff that the college library had, and Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon was one of them. I'm like, yeah, I could. Like I think I also watched that at the same time as Hero and other ones of that genre that made more of
Mhm.
a sort of like impact on Western audiences, and I could completely imagine how that is sort of massively sort of
Yeah.
formative.
Also, when I was 10 and my friend snuck a rated R film out of, I don't know, Blockbuster, and we watched The Matrix. That was incredible. So yeah, age 10, like when the year like 2000 to like 2001, when I was 10. Big years for baby Linda. The Matrix, Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, Lord of the Rings. It was all over for me.
Yeah. I mean, you watched that all as a 10-year-old. Like, there's no going back.
Right. Yeah. And of course, like the Star Wars sequels had like started coming out then too. It's just like what a time to be a nerd at 10. There was a lot happening.
Yeah. So, was your interest in pop culture journalism as a space partly just like, I love all of this stuff? I'm reading, presumably, lots of other works of journalists in this space. Was it just a thing of like, well, it's logical that I'd want to write about this?
Yeah, there was like a sense of logic about it. It was also just the fact that I feel like often the things that are popular are the things that are kind of dismissed by larger institutions. And I think that for me, I was like really interested in trying to dissect why popular things mattered and why we should be taking them seriously. So, sort of reading the work of people who took leisure seriously and took art seriously was really important. And I think that like there's a lot to be discussed and broken down with the idea of like the leisure class of creators. And I just think it's fascinating.
So I was wondering, could you point to any writers who you see as very formative for your own writing?
Yeah, so there's a lot of critics out there that I feel are very formative. Pauline Kael is an incredible writer that I just think is really understands film in a way, and I feel really really connected to her and her work because she was sort of discussing film kind of around the same time that like in film history, right? Because film is only like 120 years old, and so she was sort of discussing film at the same time that it was coming of age as like tabletop is coming of age now. So just seeing how she's thinking about like this sort of new but very experienced art form is very very cool to me. I really like Audre Lorde. Their work is just really incredible. Helped me think more about sexuality and sex and gender and the way that bodies work, and learning and educating myself on how the Black experience is interpreted through her writings. So that was really great for me. There's a really incredible fan studies writer. Yeah, Henry Jenkins. So Henry Jenkins has done like a lot of work on fan fiction and fan studies, and that has always been like really, really deeply intriguing to me. I really like Gavia Whitlaw, who's a contemporary critic. I really like Emily St. James, who's also a contemporary critic. Yeah, there's just like a lot of people out there that are doing like really interesting, fascinating work, and I'm trying to keep up with all of them. And of course, as soon as you ask, like all the names have just dropped out of my head. There's a book that I have that is this one guy whose name I totally don't remember, but it's he basically wrote an essay on the movie Roadhouse for a whole year. So it's a book of 365 critical essays on Roadhouse. It's just insane. And I'm just like, this is the sort of
I
art piece
love that.
it's so ridiculous, but it's also just like, yeah, like this is the sort of thing, and no one would consider Roadhouse like a great movie except for maybe this guy who's like, yeah, I can write 365 essays on this one crazy film. Matt Solar Zaitz is another film critic I really love. I really appreciate obviously like Roger Ebert, who doesn't love that man, and the current film critic at the New Yorker. He has opinions, man. I don't know where they come from sometimes, but he's really fascinating. I really like the way his mind works. I definitely don't agree with him all the time. I think we're like split 50-50, but there's something about him that's just funny. And I'm like, I want to know what goes on in your mind. I want to know how you think about art. God, what is his name? Let me find it. Sorry to anyone listening. I have to look up his name.
I do love when you find a critic where you were excited to read their opinions, not necessarily because you're like, I'm so aligned with this person's mind, so obviously this is going to be a good bellwether for where I like it, or no, where you're just like, no, I want to know more from what is coming from this mind.
Yeah, his name is Richard Brody, and he's been writing for The New Yorker for just about 25 years. But he's just so prolific, so incredible. Like, I don't know, there's something in his mind that like just ticks to a different beat, and I want to know what's going on in there. So yeah, I think that's a solid selection of like modern contemporary critic.
Awesome. Yeah, and I think that ties in nicely to the next question I had, because I was really interested in your thoughts on authorial voice. The Rascal introduction article mentioned not wanting to lose your voices, and I guess I was wondering how much is that something you're consciously considering while writing?
A little bit of this and a little bit of that. I think that it is very solidly something that we more or less consider we think about it much harder when we're editing it, because we are writing to get a point across or get a position across, and then it's when we're editing we sort of judge whether or not that voice serves the piece or if it was like self-indulgent. And we judge if the voice needs to like get bumped up. If it's just like, oh, this is an opinion piece and it's just very silly and like tongue-in-cheek, like you need to make this like a little goofier. Like if you are going to be writing about the D&D Aloha shirt, like you need to make sure that like you look as ridiculous as like what you're trying to lampoon. Like you can never be in a position where it's just like, I need to take myself so seriously and have this like very funny, sarcastic, like edgy voice. It's like, no, you are also part of the joke here. Like you are also a punchline. So figuring out that balance is a lot of fixing it in post, so to speak, where it's just like you write what you want to write, you write how you want to write it, and then you figure out if that voice actually serves the piece.
Yeah, editing is its own act of creation, or focusing something essentially. Yeah, thank you for sharing. That's really interesting. And then another related question I have is I wanted to ask about perspective in journalism. Many of your cultural critique pieces that are related to fandoms or other online communities, they don't approach from an outsider POV. I think it's clear in your writing that you, for lack of like a more elegant phrasing, like get it. And I want to hear more about your thoughts on perspective, whether that's relating to the fandom perspective, which is what I was thinking of first, but also if you want to talk about like topic of like a queer perspective in journalism.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the best writing about any subject comes from someone who understands that subject more than just like a superficial level. I think that we've all seen, op-eds on the transgenders from cis people that are just like, what are you actually talking about? Like, are you sure that like you did any research at all? Same with like nerds, right? Like there are sort of like nerds who will be like, well, you got this one minor fact wrong, and therefore I'm going to tell you about all these other minor facts that you got wrong because I looked through your website for 10 hours and in fact you have all these facts wrong. And we're just like, does it matter? Does it matter? Like we're talking about something else. So yeah, there's a sense of authority that comes from being within the culture that you're reporting on, and I think that that's when we see some of the best pieces is when we have people who are writing about it that actually like care about that culture, care about that ecosystem, and that understand it really, really deeply. I think that we just have to look at like that absolutely wild Rolling Stone article from like 3 or 4 weeks ago. It was like just before Rascal launched, so I didn't get a chance to talk about it, but it was like this Rolling Stone article, and it was like, you don't have to like play Dungeons and Dragons, you can listen to it too. And it was they literally said, by the way, like Critical Role and Dimension 20 are two places where you can listen to role-playing games. And then it said also there are some great actual plays for Vampire the Masquerade, and it didn't actually like list any.
My god.
It was horrible, and I was like, who wrote this? Like who wrote this and thought like, yes, this is a good article on a piece of culture that I totally understand and I am representing well. Like it was insane. So I think that was like, I'm radicalized now.
Coming away, who's coming away really like, I nailed that.
Yeah, so I think it's one of those things where tabletop is such like a niche culture that it really needs people who understand it to report on it, because there are so many things that can just get like lost in the sauce, like lost in translation, lost across time. Like the fact that so much of our cultural knowledge for tabletop role-playing games comes from blogs, comes from, the Lost G Plus community, comes from like the Forge. Like there's so many of these little like moments in the development of tabletop as an art form that are so weirdly discreet and hard to understand from an outsider perspective. Like if someone told me write about EDM music, I wouldn't know where to start. I would be so bad at that, And it was just because like I don't know jack from shit. And it feels like tabletop especially has a lot of people writing about it who are not necessarily as insider as people who are writing about it on like N World, Polygon, Bella Lost Souls, or Rascal.
Yeah. And so it reminds me of what you were saying when you were talking about Paul and Kale earlier and being like, oh, think of where TTRPG's development is in its equivalent of like map that onto film as the other sort of second kind of young genre. And then it's also like, now imagine all of that history was so much harder to trace because it's not saying you can see what did the studios release in this manifest. You're seeing like, well, this blog was actually very influential, or this book was read by loads of people. It's out of print now, or like it's yeah, it presents its own challenges via being a medium that has came of age with the internet in some senses.
Yeah, and not only that, but like a medium that was not taken seriously at its inception as like an art form,
Mm.
right? You know, one of the things that is really has become like really really clear over the past couple of years that I've been like really invested in learning about how role playing games developed over the 70s and 80s is that these people were just playing games. You know, they didn't think that they were making history or developing new art form. They were just like playing games and fucking around and writing weird letters to the editor. And that was what they were doing. They weren't interested in archiving, they weren't interested in keeping track of things. And so the games from the 70s and 80s are just like really, it's really hard to figure out exactly what was happening, when, where, why, who was doing it, because it just wasn't necessarily viewed not only by the people playing those games but also like a little bit by the people creating those games as the inception of a new and powerful art form. So it's just harder to, it's just difficult to parse through what is and isn't available.
So, as well as all of your journalistic work, you've written both games and fiction, and I was wondering how you find that informs your work. Do you find it means you're bringing something additional to relevant reviews, or are you like, I've got to keep this aspect from my mind, like compartmentalize it?
I think that it's just, you know, it's just kind of a switch that you turn it on and off. It's like I'm writing a journalism, I will write in the journalism style versus like I'm writing a, you know, book or a story, I'm writing in the fiction style. I think that there's a lot of like cross pollination, and I think the idea that like it's good to be a storyteller if you're a journalist. It's not required, but you should probably get good at it. You want to make it like fun to read. Um, so I think that there is an aspect where it sort of all bleeds over, but it really is like a very different kind of mindset. I think journalism, for me, in a lot of ways, is a lot more. I don't know how I want to say this. I feel like journalism is for me something that I have. There's a lot more duty and like service attached to journalism in a way that I don't necessarily feel attached to fiction. I think fiction is a lot more about expressing yourself and like just getting that kind of like perfecting an art versus journalism, which I sort of see a little bit more towards, you know, perfecting a story and perfecting a trade.
Yeah, no, that difference makes complete sense and is really interesting to think about. I did actually have a question that has come to mind that was not scripted, so feel free to either shoot it down or just take a while to think about it. I was curious
Mm-hmm.
if you had a sort of like methodology you approach reviews with, because I was thinking about your interview with Quinns, where Quinns was talking about like I'm playing all of
Mm-hmm.
the games I'm featuring, and I remember you're mentioning like I very firmly believe you can be reviewing based off writing. So I was wondering, yeah, do you have like this sort of set when you approach a TTRPG text? Do you have, I guess, almost like a rubric for how you're approaching it or what you want to look for it and then be sharing in a review?
Hmm. I don't. It might be easier if I did. It might be easier to write reviews if I had like a cute little rubric somewhere. No, I think that like one of the things I definitely tried to do in all of my reviews is to sort of meet the game where it wants to be. So for example, I like also, you know, in addition to loving story games, I also love like straight up OSR dungeon crawls. You know, Into the Odd is like one of my favorite games. I think it's brilliant. But that is like very much like you have four stats and you're a terrible person and everything you know your character knows. Also, here's a dungeon. And I'm like, sick. I love it. then there's also, the belonging outside belonging games where everything's like very narrative and collaborative. And I'm also just like, beautiful. It's perfect. So definitely trying to meet the games where they are is important. Definitely trying to see the kind of lineage of language that the system has drawn from, I think is important. I'm definitely of the mind that like you don't necessarily have to play a game to review a game. You can certainly do it that way, but in my opinion, when you review a game by playing it, you are really giving a review of your game, not the game. Because I think that there's just like you put in another layer of interpretation between you and the text when you play a game, which is like fine, I think, and good for reviews like that. I don't think there's any wrong way to review a game. I think is like more to the point. I don't think there's a wrong way to review a game. But I think that, there's when you play a game and then review it, you have to consider that like secondary layer of removal from the original text. But also, like, if you don't play a game, like, a game is like fundamentally an experiential piece of art. And like, are you really getting like the whole thing? I don't know. It's a balance, but yeah, I'm firmly of the belief that like you can only like you can review a game just by reading it. I think that's entirely like valid way to do it. But yeah, looking at rules, looking at readability, looking at lineage, looking at just sort of trying to feel like what is the author trying to say with this piece of art, and sort of seeing if that's something that I feel has been achieved, or if it's messy or whatever.
Yeah, no, that makes sense and is interesting. And also, I think that idea about like meeting an individual game where it is almost why like actually a rubric is maybe semi impossible to apply, because there's not a rubric that's going to cover an OSR game and a belonging outside belonging game by the same. Oh yeah, this out of 10 for this aspect. Like they're
Right.
speaking close
It's
to different languages.
Yeah. And of course there are games that are like, here is 2 pages on a Word document game. And then there's like, here is, 500 words spread out over 20 pages game. Like, same thing, but like different presentation, sort of understanding, does that matter? Should it matter? Like, maybe it matters a little bit, but is it still a good game even if it's not like that? There's just so much to consider. So definitely like taking every single game kind of as it comes, I think is very important. And another reason why I think it's hard for people outside of the ecosystem to review games is like there's so much like lineage to games that's hard for people who like don't know that to really grasp and understand. um, which I think is like, I don't think this is special or unique about tabletop games. I think it's like any art form, right? Like, if you are not familiar with radio plays and all of a sudden like, you're asked to review a radio play, what are you gonna do? What are you gonna do? Suddenly like become a radio play expert and in time to like produce a review? What if someone tells you like, okay, we want you to review this rom-com, but you're like, I've only ever watched action adventure films. Like, what are you gonna do? Do you know who Nora Ephron is? Have you seen The Bodyguard? Like, what are your opinions on Moonstruck? So it's just one of those things. Like, I don't think it's particularly unique or special to tabletop role playing games, but I think that because of the weirdly niche and insular nature of tabletop role playing games, it's harder to find people who can review a game where it is and understand how the designer has developed that game and that language and that system.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like I think there's something to be said for what you're saying in terms of like there's no wrong way to necessarily review something. Like all of these approaches are valid, and I think almost as a counter to like good review work is meeting a game where it is, I also then think as a reader you kind of need to meet a review where it is, with the context of like, oh yeah, this is a review that's focused on the text, so here are maybe some
Mm-hmm.
not limitations, but here is some like there's now an element of that where this is like a text review versus, oh, there's this other element if I'm reading a review that's focused on play where it's been mutated like that. And also in a similar way, not a unique tension or thing to be dealt with to TTRPGs. Like as a step when I was a
Right.
stand-up comedian, I took a show to the Fringe and I had 2 reviews. One of those reviews was for a show where I overslept and was 15 minutes late, and the audience had 2 people. And another review was where I had around 10 people, and also crucially showed up on time to my own show. And but they both say they're a review of the same show, but they're not. But that you also have to go into reading any review of stand up with this meeting the review where it is, which is acknowledgement of, yeah, it's a review of the night, but we can take from it other ideas. That comparison was just
Exactly.
in my mind, sort of.
Yeah, I mean, but it makes a lot of sense, right? Like, there's things that like you only appreciate fully when you play it, but there's also things that you can appreciate while reading a game that like might not ever come out in play. So figuring out how to balance that is a challenge, but like it's a challenge for everyone. And so I think it's a fun challenge. And again, a challenge that's like slightly unique to role playing games because most things that you interact with are not experiential in the way that role playing games are because you put so much of yourself and your imagination into those games in a way that's different, I think, than the kind of an artistic interpretation that you put through with like movies or a painting or even a video game. So yeah, I don't know. I think that like role playing games are really, really special and also like not very special at all.
I think it's useful to remember that always, like both of those truths at the same time. So some of your
Yeah,
most recognized and acclaimed work was on the reporting of the OGL situation. And you've done other significant
true.
investigative reporting as well. And I was
Thanks.
wondering how you approached the start of an investigation, and relatedly, how you personally develop building trust with a source.
Yeah. Oof. Well, I think building trust with a source is kind of an easier question to answer, even if it's like a harder thing to do in practice. A lot of it is like being really clear about what you're doing at any time. A lot of it is being honest about where you are in the investigation and like what you are capable of doing. A lot of it is sort of discussing like, well, source, what do you want to like? What are you trying to get out of talking to me, a journalist, and sort of weighing that against my responsibilities as a journalist and my responsibilities to be as not necessarily unbiased, but as like truthful and honest as possible. I don't think that there is such a thing as unbiased journalism. It's just like it just doesn't exist. Everyone has biases. It's about like finding a position that is truthful and honorable and like honors the story and honors the people who are talking to you and also like is not necessarily doing like abject harm to like whatever position they're taking, right? Like I don't necessarily think that we should be platforming really violent bigots as if their views are truth, right? But I think that there is a usefulness and a utility in like taking those points of view and like holding them up to the light. So it's a delicate balance to try and figure out like, okay, is this something that's giving it air or if it's something that's like actually worth dissecting. But yeah, basically like building trust with the source is all about being honest and transparent, being really clear about everything. It's just good communication. And yeah, that's building trust with the source. It sounds easy. It's much harder in practice.
Do you think it
Yeah.
relates to some of the positionality and sense of like getting it that we talked about earlier? Because I remember you just saying like, "Oh yeah, we've all seen like horrible articles by cis people about the transgenders," and I'm also like, "Yeah, I mean, one of the earliest pieces of advice I got when coming out was don't talk to journalists." Now, admittedly, I live in the UK, so that's another factor there, but do you think some sense
Yeah.
of coming and being like, I'm not an outsider, I'm not gonna be like sensationalizing whatever things
Mhm.
you're talking to me about is part of that process?
Yeah, I think so. And I think it's a lot of it is a lot of it is meeting sources where they are, meeting stories where they are, and it's just like I'm writing about fan fiction and I'm writing about it seriously and I'm not writing about it to like make fun of people and just sort of like being really clear. It's like I'm writing about fan fiction because I think it's like a serious topic that deserves study and I think that the people who were in fandoms are people who were doing something really interesting culturally and we deserve to look at that like cultural movement rather than saying like these weird fan fiction authors, what are they doing with their smut and their vampires, like what are they thinking? expressing gender. Crazy. So,
Yeah. These people
just
have
like
feelings about Link in a trans way. Ew.
that one's so funny to me because that was so, like such a neutral article where it really was people have feelings about Link in a trans way, and then people were all like, how dare you say Link is trans? And I'm like, I think that you might not know what you're actually saying. Like, I don't think you've read this article because that's not what I'm saying. People are nuts.
Yeah.
But yeah.
It's very telling when someone is like, I think it is an insult for anyone to take a trans reading of a character. I'm like, oh, that says so much about how you see the world.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's on getting trust. On building investigations, it's about, sort of establishing yourself in the community and getting people to talk to you and getting people to tell you stories and being able to sort of parse what is important to the culture versus what is important to the individual. And that's often where stories like live or die, is like, if one person was an asshole to you at your company, like, that's not newsworthy. People are assholes to other people every day. But if it's like a pattern of abuse, or if it's like they're doing something illegal and getting away with it, or like they're doing something really shady and nobody knows what to do about it, or it's something like, yeah, this like one incident has never been like really addressed and we don't know what to do next, sort of parsing out the personal from the newsworthy and the personal from the cultural, I think, is really how you figure out how to pursue stories and pursue investigation. But yeah, just figuring out like what's newsworthy, I think, is a question that every single journalist and every single outlet has to deal with, and trying to figure out where the time gets spent, where our cultural capital lies, like where our attention goes, and trying to figure out like, is this newsworthy because it's happening to this person or because it's happening at all? Just trying to figure out where things land. And newsworthiness is always kind of determined by like, is it new? Is it unusual? Is it out of the ordinary? Is it different? And that's what any decision in any newsroom hinges on, is like, what makes this different from other things, and trying to figure out if it's worth spending time on.
Yeah. It's really interesting questions, and thank you for sharing your sort of thoughts behind that. Oh
Yeah,
no,
I mean,
you
I
can
will
go.
fully admit though, like a lot of this is the questions that you sort of ask yourself in any newsroom. This is definitely not like me being super deep and a thoughtful journalist. It's a lot of like, this is what the trade of journalism is, right? This is like how people across the world think about journalism and think about like newsworthiness. And it's kind of like this constant push and pull, is like, well, what makes this worthy of news and worthy of like newness and worthy of discussion? Anyway.
Yeah, I think it ties into what you were mentioning earlier about like taking the role of being a journalist like as a bit with more sort of obligation and responsibilities than other kinds of writing. Doing this podcast, I spend a lot of time thinking about presence as an interviewer, about being like engaged, having a good energy that
Mm-hmm.
can build a rapport. I think, like, personally for me, I'm bringing a lot of experience, like, as a mix from my time as a stand-up comedian and as a teacher. And obviously, like, this structure of interview being like recorded and stuff is different than other kinds. But I was wondering, you talked at the off mic when I was like, oh, here's how everything's going, and you were like, oh, I don't know if you know this, I'm all out at interviews. But so I was wondering, like, what are the things you're considering when approaching an interview?
What do I consider when I approach an interview? I think goals is obviously like the easy answer here. I consider what my goals are for the interview. If the interview is to just like discover who the person is as a person, that's like an easy interview. You sort of like go through the usual structures and like personalize it. And then there's other interviews where it's like, well, I want to get them to say something. And that's when you sort of like have to craft your questions around a narrative. That's when you sort of have to figure out what you are trying to get people to say. or what you want them to admit to, or what you want them to let slip, and sort of crafting interviews based around the narrative that you are trying to prove or disprove or get a new vision of. But yeah, and then crafting interviews so that like you, like when I interview sources that I know are like not necessarily like really excited to talk to me, that are sort of like more hostile sources, kind of like coming prepared with questions that like you already know the answers to. You just need them to say it. You just need to hear them say it. And you need them to know that you know those answers. And you're just like, I know what you don't want to say to me. And I need you to tell me either I don't want to comment on that, or like you need a lie, you're gonna lie to me. And
Mm.
that's fine because I have like I can do something about that. So um yeah, the interviews where the goal is like, I just want to learn more about the thing that you're doing or the person you are to me a little bit, are very much like the easy interviews because they're conversational, right? It's like this, it's like a back and forth, it's funny, it's joking. And when you do interviews where you like want something from a source, it's also conversational and joking, and like there's a back and forth, and you form a rapport, but also you have a carefully crafted list of questions that like have a cadence to them where it's just like, okay, we're gonna push, we're gonna pull back, we're gonna like do something funny, we're gonna push a little further, and it's just like this back and forth where you are working to create a relationship within the interview where they want to tell you about what they're doing, even if they really should not be telling you anything.
Thanks. That's, yeah, that makes sense. And it's, of course, interesting, yeah, that obviously you're going to approach an interview with Quinn's very differently than you'd approach interviewing the NFT D&D people.
Yeah, well, just to sort of go on that, like the NFT D&D folks, in an interview like that, where I am also doing a fact check, I sort of like go up to them and I'm like very, very clear. And I'm like, hey, I have like 30 facts that I need you to like say yes or no on because it's not clear, because like I just need someone to verify this. So we go through like the 30 facts, and then we have a conversation, then we like dive into things that are interesting. But yeah, there's some interviews where it's just like, I need you to verify or clarify, and you have to be like really, really clear with a lot of these sources and a lot of these folks, where you're just like, hey, like we don't need to have a discussion, we can if you want, but really I just need the facts. Like I need you to say yes, no, or no, let me clarify, or like almost let me clarify. So
Yeah.
those sorts of
I
interviews are
need the facts
very,
or your refusal to give me the facts on record.
yeah. And then there's like other interviews where someone will give me a statistic and they'll be like, this proves that we're good. And I'm like, you see how this is actually not good. You just sort of have to like, you have to be prepared to push back against the narratives that people are going to tell you, because they have an agenda talking to you just as much as you have an agenda talking to them, especially in investigative interviews. I'm just like constantly reminded of, there was this interview with Taylor Swift in the Times, and or Time magazine, and that when she won like Woman of the Year, like Person of the Year, and she said that she felt like a failure after some album, Midnights or something. And she was like, yeah, I just felt like a failure and X, Y, and Z. And the interviewer was thinking to themselves and wrote this, who am I to tell Taylor Swift how she feels? And I'm like, that's literally your job. She has never produced a work that didn't immediately go into the top 10 whatevers. She's by no stretch of the imagination a failure in like any part of her life. What the fuck do you mean? It is not your position as a journalist to like push back when a very rich, famous, influential person says I'm a failure. Like, are you out of your mind? What are you doing? Like, what's your thought process for just thinking like, yes, I will let this woman control the narrative entirely and
Yeah,
I will
it's
not push
also,
back on like her feelings?
yeah, because all then you
Crazy.
end with is just this statement of this is how Taylor Swift says she feels. Whereas, like, if you push back on it or question it, even if you don't get like going, oh yeah, I guess not, you may get the fact of like, oh, she feels this way specifically because of critical reception or because of comparative things, and then you have a more
Mm-hmm.
interesting and specific insight into how someone says they feel, at least, and you maybe get more by rather than just go, oh, who am I?
Yeah. So I think that like journalists definitely have an obligation to like push against narratives that are being presented, but also be like really receptive to the idea that like we might not have the full story.
So, how does independence feel? Which is maybe a big question, but yeah, I'm interested in are there any differences that immediately feel very clear to you?
I mean, just the idea, just like having to deal all with it all, having to deal with it all is very stressful. I'm getting better at it, and I'm sort of getting better at like, okay, let's just focus on writing. Let's just focus on like getting through it. And we're like, we are, you know, growing pains as we sort of go through this like first month of our quote unquote soft launch. But we're hoping kind of by next week or like early April to sort of be like, okay, officially we are hard launch. We're Rascal. We're publishing 2 stories a day every week, and we can actually keep this up. So independence feels great. It's terrifying. It's the worst thing I've ever done, and I don't want to do anything else.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
that makes complete sense. Digging more into specifics about Rascal, having read the ethics, standards, and disclosure section, I was
Mhm.
interested in what informed those standards, what discussions you had around them as the three of you. Yeah.
Well, we knew that we wanted to be very clear about our policies, not only for ourselves, but so that folks could hold us accountable when they think that we are not upholding them. And we thought that the best way to do that was to make it really really clear, like, here are our standards, here's how we treat people, here's how we expect our work to be perceived, here's what we want to do with regards to that. So it was never a question of if we would have those available for the public to read, but how we would do it, where they would go, what we would draw from. We drew a lot from the National Society of Journalists and their standard. And we also took a lot of notes from the Colorado Sun, which has like a really, really robust ethics and standards because they are like a really fiercely independent local journalist outfit out in Denver. So we just really wanted to make sure that we were all on the same page, and we wanted our audience to know where we stood as well.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I wanted to ask about what for you, along with your colleagues, put into the presentation of a news outlet. Like, what was important to convey, and I guess also how was this informed by the presentations of other outlets you've all worked for over the years?
The biggest thing was we didn't want ads, because ads are just horrible to like have as part of a reading experience and horrible to have as part of like a news journalism experience. So we do no ads, which means that we were really going to focus on like long form writing. We wanted having the announcement section, having the announcement set apart from the editorial journalism was really important to us because we wanted to find a way to like give back to the community without necessarily rewriting press releases, you know, 3 times a day. So we're just like, we'll just publish the press release. People do it all the time. We just won't put our names on it. And, you know, we'll have, you know, Paizo or whatever, or whoever does it, it'll be their name on it. So that like everyone knows it's not us, it's these guys. And we are just like, moderating this like public space for people to get these announcements out there. So that was really important to us. We just sort of wanted something that looked like a news site, that had columns and bylines and tags and was easily searchable and looked cool, which is why we hired Johan Noor to do our logo.
Yeah, it does look cool. It's like it's got
Thanks.
just sort of this instantly like it feels like it. I remember the first time I looked through the website, there was this sense of like, yes, this feels like a news site. I feel like I am reading the news, which maybe sounds really simplistic as I'm saying it, but no, like it put me in a reading mood, and then it also felt cool and sure of itself.
Yeah, I think that I don't know if we ever felt like totally confident about it, but we definitely felt like we know what we want to do. We want to write. We're writers. We don't want to worry about ads. We don't want to worry about like cool layout or graphics or videos. Like, we are writers first and foremost. Everything else will come like secondary, tertiary, or whatever. I don't even know what the name is for something that comes fourth in a list.
Auxiliary.
Auxiliary is a good catch-all. Is auxiliary fourth? It doesn't matter.
I think actually
anyway,
it's not. I don't think it goes fourth.
But yeah, so we really wanted to make sure that the writing was at the forefront. And I think that just kind of as a consequence of that, it looks like a site where like, oh yeah, I'm going to sit down and read this and there won't be interruption. And we are trying to keep everything like 3,000 words or less, but like sometimes we flex up, sometimes we go down to like 600, 800 words. But we really are allowing ourselves space. Like we believe that people will read if we post it. We firmly believe that people will read longer work and longer writing and longer articles. And we are going to try and facilitate the easiest experience possible for those people.
Yeah, it totally makes sense because I think, yeah, certain legacy outlets, if you are reading them because of how ads are working, it feels like when I have gone to the supermarket and don't have headphones, and so I'm like, I'm getting so overstimulated, I need to be really quick here. I think on other websites. Mm-hmm. Whereas, yeah, the elegant display that is like foregrounding like writing and stuff that's exciting and interesting to read really doesn't make me feel like, oh, I gotta rush through this.
Yeah, good, excellent. I love to hear that because changing anything about Rascal is really hard. So we're like, God, it's working.
So last year you won an ENnie award and you were nominated for the Diana Jones Award. How do you feel about receiving recognition as a journalist?
Mixed feelings. I think good in the way that like everyone likes attention, even me. So there's a part of it where it's just like, I love being popular and cool and pretty and people like me. And that's like the superficial answers that like everyone loves being popular. It's like a whole thing. And then there's other parts where I'm just like, ugh, things would be a lot easier if I was just a journalist and no one knew who I was. And then alternatively, things are a lot easier because people know who I am. Like, I don't think that Rascal would have gotten off to this kind of start it did if people didn't know me, didn't know Chase, didn't know Rowan. So it's kind of an unfortunate side effect of just the way things are set up now. For journalists to make themselves a product as much as they make their writing a product, which is a bummer, but that's it. Yeah, it felt nice to be liked by people and win an award because I won a popularity contest. Like, I love winning popularity contests. It's very nice. But yeah, really, really grateful that, you know.
Yeah, it makes sense. Yeah, I remember before, because I only went to Gen Con because I'd won like the Emerging Designer Award, and I kept telling all of my friends, like, oh, obviously at this convention I'm going to be the belle of the ball. Basically, it was the phrase I kept using for some random reason. But yeah, I was interested in what you were saying that I found interesting, like the sort of contradictory feelings it can bring up, and yeah, the pressure for turning who you are into part of your appeal rather than just what you do is something that it brings up just lots of complicated feelings.
Yeah, it's not my favorite thing, and it's definitely something that I have to kind of like actively moderate, which mostly involves me going outside, touching grass, and talking to people who are not online. That's my secret for friends who are not online.
Yeah, we're close to finishing up. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I've found it super interesting to talk with you. Can you let everyone know both where they can... I mean, we've obviously talked about Rascal loads, but mentioning where people can be following Rascal on socials, following you on socials, beyond the simple... and signing up to mailing lists and such.
Yeah, so you can follow me personally on literally any social media at Lin Codega, LINCODEGA. Rascal.news is where all my writing is right now. And we are on social media also pretty much everywhere at Rascal_news. And I would like to encourage people to sign up to be a free subscriber at Rascal. Just because that helps us out immensely. And you do get access to some public articles. I think we have maybe 10 that are subscriber only. And then if you feel like we're doing a good job, if you want to like pay us, that'd be rad. We would love that. But also, we're really happy if people are just showing up to support at the lurker $0 subscriber level. So yeah, rascal.news for fun.
And then the final question I have to ask is essentially, what's the biggest lesson you feel you've learned from all of this TTRPG scene, pop culture journalism? What is the thing you sort of take away and hold?
I think the biggest thing that I've taken from being like a pop culture and tabletop journalist is that the scene is way smaller than we think it is. We already think it's small. It's even smaller than that. It is so small. But I think that necessary size doesn't necessarily matter. It's still worthy of artistic critique and journalism. And then the other thing that I've learned is that we need to be actively working to dismantle capitalist structures and carceral mindsets. And we need to be investigating that in our own work and in our business every single day. So, I mean, that's something that like we discuss at Rascal pretty much every week. It's like, how are we making sure that while we are operating within a capitalist society and a capitalist system, we are not necessarily binding ourselves by those same structures and figuring out what parts of that system work for us and what parts of that system we need to push against and how we do it. So, yeah, just sort of like this kind of constant self improvement and move towards a better, more equitable society, no matter how small or weird or strange that movement looks, even if that movement is literally just a news site about tabletop role playing.
Hell yeah. This has been The Life Path of Lin Codega. I have been Kayla Dice. Thank you for listening. Good night.